So I'd like to welcome you all to the Ty Unno Memorial Lecture in Shin Buddhist Studies, which is an annual event now, which is generously sponsored by the Ada Howe Kent Fund, the Religion Department, and the Program in Buddhist Studies. We're very grateful to Jamie Hubbard, who organized the lecture, but sadly cannot be here tonight. So we'll have him with us in spirit. And also we're grateful to Phoebe McKinnell, who set up all the arrangements. I'm Carol Zaleski from the Religion Department. I'm going to just say a few words about Ty Unno before introducing our speaker, the Reverend Dr. David Matsumoto. And after the talk, we hope you'll join us for some very nice refreshments and conversation over at the Dewey Hall Common Room. If you don't know where that is, just follow us, just across the way. Ty Unno, who passed away in December 2014, was born in Japan in 1929 to a Shin Buddhist priest and his wife. The family moved to the U.S. in 1935, and during the Second World War, they endured life in internment camps in this country. They settled in California after the war, and Ty went to Berkeley to study English literature, great love of his for his whole life. A meeting with D.T. Suzuki changed the course of Ty's life, however. Though he never lost his love of English literature and poetry, he went to Tokyo University to study for a doctorate in Buddhist studies. Eventually, Ty would be ordained as the 13th generation Shin Buddhist priest in his family, and so he became, all at once, scholar, teacher, and minister, which is also true of his son Mark Unno, who is carrying this legacy to the 14th generation. Ty came here to Smith College in 1971 and immediately set about to transform our curriculum and culture by introducing areas of East Asian and religious studies that were barely recognized up until then, really not on the map. He brought a Japanese tea house and garden to the shores of Paradise Pond. He brought us a never-ending stream of scholars and practitioners. He brought us Aikido. Ty was a 4th degree black belt in that martial art. And in partnership with his wife, Alice, he brought a full spectrum of Buddhist arts to our community, tea ceremony, flower arranging, and the like. He established a Zen Buddhist meditation group as well and found experienced leaders, teachers to lead it. And then together with Alice, his wife, he founded the Northampton Shin Buddhist Sangha. We have a few members of that here, which is wonderful. They led this group until 2007, when Ty and Alice moved to Oregon to be near Mark, their son, and his wife, Megumi. I know it would mean the world to Ty, as it does to us, that we have Reverend Matsumoto here to speak in his honor and his memory. Reverend Matsumoto is the president of the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, where he is also the George and Sake Aratani Professor of Contemporary Shin Buddhist Studies. He was born in Detroit, grew up in St. Paul, attended the University of Minnesota, practiced as an attorney in Minnesota before becoming ordained as a Shin Buddhist priest and minister. He received his MA and PhD in Buddhist Studies from the ancient and venerable Ryokoku University in Tokyo. And in addition to leading the Institute of Buddhist Studies, which is renowned for the training of Shin Buddhist ministers and scholars, Reverend Matsumoto has translated important works of Shin Buddhist scholarship and has written articles on narrative theory, translation studies, and theologies of disability from a contemporary Shin Buddhist perspective. So please join me in welcoming David Matsumoto. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Carol. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for the Ty Unno Memorial Lecture. In honor of the fact that we have members of the Northampton Shin Buddhist Sangha here, and honor of Unno Sensei, I'd like to begin with Gassho, okay? So we have a little bit of a strip of Amida Buddha there, so please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, Namanda, Namanda. Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. It's my first visit to Northampton, and I've heard many stories about Northampton. Unno Sensei, I look upon him as one of my really important Buddhist teachers. I never studied with him formally at a school, but met him many times in California. Often, I think when he was still here at Smith, he would come out to California this summer to teach at something called the Pacific Seminar. And that's when I first met him. And after that, I had many opportunities to talk with him one-on-one about my thoughts and questions. Perhaps this is an expression that will resonate with some of you. I remember Unno Sensei as a person with a very kind and keen blade. And he would compassionately slice my presuppositions and mistakes with great care and great kindness. And I appreciate that aspect of his mentorship very well. And I'm also very fond of Alice, who kept him in line and kept all the rest of us in line. And I'm a good friend with Mark. One of the things that I'm also very honored is that after Unno Sensei passed away, I was the minister at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. I had the honor of officiating at his funeral. And it was really a very momentous event. I think after that time, there were memorial services in Los Angeles, Hawaii, and here in Northampton as well. So Unno Sensei had many people who had learned from him and were indebted to him. And so I'm glad that we can all gather together now in his memory to share some thoughts about Shin Buddhism. So today the topic that I chose is this one. It's called Taking Amida's Vows as Our Own Toward a Cultivation of a Culture of Compassion. Kind of a mouthful, but I'll try to explain what I mean by that. First of all, we have a photo of Unno Sensei, born in 1929, passed away in 2014. As I mentioned, he's tremendous influences. I found these things on the internet. It's amazing what you find on the internet. I was looking for his photo and I came upon these, Googling him. And I know this is from his book, Bits of Rubble Turned into Gold. So when he says, Buddhism is a path of supreme optimism, for one of its basic tenets is that no human life or experience is to be wasted or forgotten, but all should be transformed into a source of wisdom and compassionate living. I think a very profound statement, one that resonates and is important for all of us today in these very troubled times. This is sort of became the motivation for me as I was thinking about this talk, and sort of became an inspiration for some of the ideas that I came to draw from Shinran and from the Shin tradition. I also want to pay my respects to another person. He's my teacher in Japan. His name was Reverend Takamaro Shigaraki. I mentioned him because he's also a great influence on me, and he and Unno Sensei were actually great friends. They passed away the same year, and Shigaraki Sensei was a person of great renown, a person who I think really shook the foundations of Honganji and Shin Buddhism to the core, and introduced ideas and thinking that I think are very important for us today. He and Unno Sensei, I think, are some of the really important and outstanding thinkers in Shin in the 20th and 21st century. So I'll be also mentioning some of the lessons that I learned from Shigaraki Sensei. So anyway, this is sort of a general preface that I mentioned. In this age of darkness, and I think we can all have a sense of the darkness that's around us, in which greed, anger, and foolishness, the three poisons set out in Buddhism, abound. Many religious traditions willingly share perspectives on the causes and possible resolution of our travails. Shin Buddhism, I think, has been relatively silent for a number of reasons. Perhaps some of it's cultural, historical, sociological, legal, who knows. But in the grand scheme of things, the Shin Buddhist voice has been one that has not been heard as loudly and as often as we hear the voices from other Buddhists or from other religious people. But I think that's changing, and that's about to change for a number of reasons. So my suggestion is that Shin Buddhism, its teachings, its lifestyle, its practices, its tradition and history can offer insights that might bring about a transformation of consciousness and cultivate a culture of compassion in ourselves and the world. So that's my theme for today's talk. This is something that those of you who are in the class today, you're familiar with this. I'll start out with the same story. There's a basic narrative, I think, that frames all of Pure Land Buddhism and Shin Buddhism as well. Let me just go through it with you. There's a very famous and well-known sutra called the Larger Sutra of Immeasurable Life. And in that sutra, Shakyamuni Buddha tells a story. He tells a story of a bodhisattva named Dharmakara, who was a king, but aspired to attain enlightenment for the sake of himself and for all beings. And so under the guidance of a Buddha, Lokeshvara Raja, the bodhisattva went out and said in the sutra he viewed every Buddha land in the cosmos, and there are innumerable Buddha lands, and from them he selected the most superlative features from those lands. He then proclaimed 48 great vows, and all bodhisattvas make vows, vowing to become established in their wisdom, practicing in their compassion, but also setting out Buddha lands, places where they can become active and influential in their teaching and guidance. And also in these vows, the bodhisattva set out a path by which all beings could attain birth in his wondrous land and thereby attain enlightenment. And so according to the story then, the bodhisattva engaged in practices over endless eons of time. He attained perfect enlightenment, and he became the Buddha of immeasurable light, Amitabha, and immeasurable life, Amitayus. He created a pure realm of peace and bliss known as Skavati, where beings could practice the way to Buddhahood, and he established a path for birth for all beings. Now, this is the story. This story is a narrative of great power, great beauty, and it's inspired many people throughout the thousands of years since it was first produced at the turn of the Common Era. Many people have come to aspire to attain birth in the Pure Land. However, and here's where some of my questioning begins, it seems to me, as I reflect upon Pure Land Buddhism and Shin in particular, that there have been many attempts to, I think, understand this story and to put it into modern terms, but I think that there have been certain interpretations that perhaps are questionable. And so one of them is that Dharmakara became Amida Buddha 10 kalpas ago, according to the story, and so people conclude that we are now saved. Our salvation was assured right then and there, so we're already saved. And so therefore there's nothing that we need do in order to attain birth. Our path to birth has already been created. It was created 10 kalpas ago. And not only that, there's no practice for us to engage in. There's nothing that we need to do. We simply have to believe in this beautiful story of Amida Buddha, for it is already true. All we can do is recite the Nembutsu saying Namo Amida Butsu as an expression of gratitude for our having been saved, and our lives become those of gratitude. We know that after we die, we will be born in the Pure Land in the life to come. So that's a story that we often hear. It's often associated with Pure Land Buddhism, Shin in particular. And my position here, my assertion is that I think this story, although it seems to be related to the original Dharmakara narrative, is one that has taken on features that I think are sort of oversimplifying the story. So, as a result of this, the way in the story of Dharmakara and Amida has been framed, many people describe Shin Buddhism as it's just a Buddhism of faith, or some people might say it's a Buddhist Christianity or sort of a Christian Buddhism. It's a Buddhism without practice or merit. It's a teaching of salvation of the evil person through faith and other power. And our attempts to be truly compassionate are ultimately fruitless. We've heard these assertions made. I've heard them made. I think that these are assertions or sort of conclusions that are drawn from a faulty narrative. Okay? And I think this is an oversimplification of the Dharmakara story. So let's talk about Jodo Shinshu, which is a Japanese word. It could be translated in a variety of ways. One way that it's been translated is as the true essence of the Pure Land Way, or the true teaching, or the true path of Pure Land Buddhism, founded by Shinran, who lived in the Kamakura period of Japan. The Nembutsu, that is in Shin Buddhism, that is Namo Amida Butsu, is a name of the Buddha. It calls us to awaken to a life filled with wisdom and compassion. And in Shinran's thinking, it is important that we hear the call of Nembutsu, which has the potential to inform and fulfill our engagement in society and in the world. So I think there's a very activist core to Shin Buddhism that's often missing in the discussions or the narratives that we hear about it today. So these are the points that I want to make. That the practice of Namo Amida Butsu arises as the ultimate religious experience of Shinjin in the midst of this world here and now. And I reframe that statement into 5 bullet points. We awaken to the interconnectedness of all lives with a sense of unrelenting self-scrutiny and a warning against self-righteousness, and realize a radical transformation of our consciousness. By taking Amida Buddha's vows as our own, we are able to dare to aspire for peace, freedom, and equality in ourselves and the world, and with grateful awareness of our stake in all lives, engage authentically in compassionate work. I think that's a narrative that better describes at least my understanding of Shinran's teaching of Shin Buddhism, especially as I've learned it from Unno Sensei and Shigaragi Sensei, okay, and other great teachers. Let me explain what I mean. So the first bullet point, we awaken to the interconnectedness of all lives. The practice of Namo Amida Butsu arises, again, is ultimate religious experience. So here's a quotation from Unno Sensei from his book, River of Fire, River of Water. Some of you are familiar with it. I also found this on the internet. It's great. Awakening is dynamic, constantly evolving in accordance with life's realities. A very short statement, but a very, very important one. Awakening. Here, Unno Sensei describes this experience of Shinjin, which is a Japanese word, which we find in Shin Buddhism. It's often translated, has been translated as faith or trust or commitment. Here, Unno Sensei identifies this experience as an experience of awakening, of opening our eyes, of seeing something that we never saw before, of seeing in a way that we couldn't even conceive of before. And that this experience of awakening is dynamic. It's ever changing, ever evolving, ever moving in response to and in accordance to the realities that we experience in life. So it's not simply this abstract notion. It's not something idea, oh, we were saved by Amida 10 kalpas ago, therefore already saved. It's not that sort of static, abstract, conceptualized notion. Awakening as an experience is alive. It's real, it's constantly evolving in response to the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. That's how I take Unno Sensei's words. So, Shinjin is an experience of awakening. It's more than faith, belief, or trust. It describes the experience in which we awaken within the Nembutsu to the true nature of ourselves and the inconceivable wish of life. This awareness, our awakening and living, is none other than the arising of Buddha's wisdom, which manifests right here and now. So one of the aspects of Shinran's writings, as I'll talk about it in a while, is that in this awakening of through the practice of Nembutsu, and there is a practice, the practice of Nembutsu, we come to awaken, to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts in ways that we had never experienced before. And that within this, we also are able to live. We realize a transformation of our personhood, of our consciousness. And that this activity is what Shinran calls the arising of Buddha's wisdom. This is the arising of wisdom in this world. And I'll explain what I mean just in a little while. So wisdom means we come to know things and others by becoming them. We talked about that a little bit in class. It's kind of this very profound Mahayanistic logic of knowing things, knowing beings by becoming them, by realizing the absolute connection, the oneness, the inseparability that we have with all beings. Okay, so it's to awaken to that inseparability, that interconnectedness of all being. And this interconnectedness of being, I believe, is expressed in the phrase, Amida Buddha is immeasurable light and life. Okay. So often immeasurable light and life, they're sort of expressions, symbolic expressions, seen to represent wisdom and compassion. And I think there's a lot to that. But in another way, I think this sense of immeasurability takes us out of our conventional modes of thought, takes us away from our everyday thinking, brings us to a world which is beyond the self. And that this life, this light, which is the light of wisdom and life which we participate in, is is an expression then of this interconnectedness of all being. So Shigaraki Sensei mentions something like this in more concrete terms. So he says, life constantly sacrifices itself in order to nurture a new life. It is just like a plant that withers and decays so as to become the compost that will nourish a new sprout, or like a parent who curtails her own life so that her child may realize full growth. Immeasurable life symbolizes this activity of nurturing true life, activity that is directed to all living beings. Thus, Amida Buddha signifies that which illuminates and nurtures all people and all living things across infinite space and infinite time. So this sense then of infinite, of immeasurable light in life, I think is an important one, because it awakens for us. It allows us to awaken to this ongoing dynamic evolution of life itself. So immeasurable life isn't just talking about some Buddha out there in the cosmos that never dies, but it's talking about this infinite evolution and nurturing of life, like a plant growing to its fullness and then withering away, becoming the nutrients for another life, or a parent devoting her life to a child so that that child can flourish and grow. That's a sense of infinite life that makes sense to us in our own existence, and it's something, I think, that interconnectedness, the inseparability, the mutual nurturing and support that is expressed by Amida Buddha as immeasurable light in life. And it allows us then to accept ourselves and others just as we are. We awaken to the reality that all things that live on this earth are interconnected with all other things in conditional arising. All beings are worthy of respect equally, and their existences have meaning, for they all depend on each other and assist one another. We recognize each other mutually and reciprocally and see that self and others live in non-dualistic harmony. And so this sense of harmony becomes an important value, an important virtue for Buddhists, all Buddhists, not just Shin Buddhists, but all Buddhists and all human beings. This image over here is a drawing of a person by the name of Prince Shotoku, who lived in Japan in the 6th and 7th centuries. Prince Shotoku has been credited often by people, especially in Japan, as the one who introduced Buddhism to Japan. I think it's a little bit of an overstatement. He was the Prince Regent at the time, and certainly was a patron and a supporter of Buddhism. He also engaged in doing translations of Buddhist texts from Chinese languages into Japanese as well. And so it's said that Prince Shotoku had a deep felt sense of harmony, okay, so whatever that might mean. So living in oneness or harmony, it doesn't require that we all be exactly the same. Rather, within oneness, we're able to live in harmony when we are able to know and accept each other and everything as it is. We're able to appreciate and value differences between ourselves and others. We're able to live as ourselves together with all other beings in mutual tolerance, acceptance, and gratitude. So harmony is grounded on difference. It's not on sameness. And so sometimes, especially in the times in which we find ourselves living, there's there's a criticism of words like diversity or difference and that type of thing. Whereas in Buddhism, I think that sense is that life is one and in harmony because of difference. If we were all the same, it would be monotony, it wouldn't be harmony. Prince Shotoku is said to have written a constitution, a 17-article constitution, long ago, in which he wanted Japan, the nation of Japan, or the nation at the time, to be founded upon Buddhist principles. One of the articles said that all people in Japan will take refuge in the 3 treasures, the triple gem, okay, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. But also in Article 10, this appears. It's kind of long, but I think it's worth reading because it's pretty important stuff. So this is my sort of loose translation of that article. It says, "You shall be free of anger as well as wrath. You shall not be angry at another's being different from you. Each person has his own mind, and each mind has its own way. What another thinks to be right, I may think to be wrong. What I think to be right, another may think to be wrong. But I am no saint. He is no fool. We are both just common mortals. How can we tell what is really right or wrong? Both he and I are sometimes wise and sometimes foolish, just as an earring is endless. Therefore, you should reflect upon your own faults, even when another becomes furious with you. You should consult with others, even when you think that you are right. Wow. Beautiful language to read and think about, really, really hard instructions to live by. I don't know how many of you are able to do that when you're having an argument with somebody, especially a significant person in your life, and your backs are getting up and you're yelling at each other. How many of you, and I include myself in this, are able to say, okay, you may be right, I may be wrong, let's have an open, free discussion about that. Not many of us. Let alone, it's in this today's climate, both in the world and our society, this kind of thinking is non-existent, okay? People make divisions. There's, people line up on either side of an aisle. They point fingers of blame and hatred and scorn at each other. There's no sense of harmony, okay? But so I think Buddhism has this to offer to the world. It's a beautiful instruction. It's a really difficult thing to live by, but it's an ideal. And I think Buddhism presents this value, this virtue, this ideal to the world and to ourselves, especially to ourselves, to seek to struggle with, to strive for this as an ideal, but also to live in the tension between the ideal and what's really the case in our lives. But I think this is an important aspect that comes about through an awakening to Amida Buddha as infinite, immeasurable light and life. So there's another bullet point. And this is my translation of Shigaraki Sensei's words. With a sense of unrelenting self-scrutiny and a warning against self-righteousness. I think this is also a very important aspect of the Shin Buddhist attitude, sort of the character or nature of Shin Buddhism as it involves a reflection upon oneself and in the world, okay? So Shinjin involves a profound self-examination, looking deeply within ourselves with unrelenting self-scrutiny. So I think Shinjin is not simply faith, it's not simply belief, but it's awakening to the world and awakening to ourselves. But this awakening experience doesn't just take place instantly. It's a process that one engages in throughout life. And it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to, when we're in an argument and we're yelling at someone else and we're convinced that we're right, to turn the tables or turn the direction of our inquiry back into ourselves. Asking, gee, am I really right? Am I always going to be correct? Am I the one who's, who really knows the answer here? And to bring those questions back, to engage in scrutiny, in self-scrutiny, in an ongoing way. That's why I love Shigaraki Sensei's expression, this unrelenting self-scrutiny. It never ends, okay? Never allow ourselves to start patting ourselves on the back. Wow, what a gee, I reflected on myself. I must be a good Buddhist. Well, once we do that, then we've lost it altogether. And Shinran also uses this phrase, manifesting signs of rejecting the defiled world. We abandon our minds of self-power and entrust completely in other power. I'll get to that in just a second. So Shinran's insight was that true wisdom is found in our experience of our foolishness. The Japanese characters on the side are yo o ito shirushi, signs of rejecting the defiled world, okay? So, to abandon the mind of self-power, what does that mean? We often hear in Shin Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, well, there's self-power and there's other power. Self-power we shouldn't do, other power is good. Sometimes in the conventional ways of thinking about Shin Buddhism, people even say, oh, self-power is bad. You shouldn't do self-power. You shouldn't meditate. That's self-power. Bad, bad, bad. I don't get that. I really don't get that. Because I think that's sort of just shutting us off from the realities of our life and the realities of our practices, okay? In addition, I think this obsession with self-power, it mistakes self-power for self-effort. I think Shin Buddhism and Shinran never said, don't try. Self-effort is not what's being discussed, but it's the mind of self-power. That's the key phrase here. What is the mind of self-power? And so to abandon that in sort of a negative framing this here, Shinran says, admonishes the various and diverse kinds of people, masters of Hinayana and Mahayana, ignorant beings, good or evil. One, to abandon the conviction that one is good, to cease relying on the self, to stop reflecting knowingly on one's evil heart, and further to abandon the judging of people as good or bad, good and bad. That's one of the ways in which he talks about the mind of self-power. There are many other ways, but I think this is one that hits home. This goes back to a discussion of harmony, because I think this is part of how we're wired. This is how we're made up. This is kind of how we relate to others and to ourselves. The sense of having this conviction, I'm really a good person. I'm really good. I have the best intentions for myself and for the world. Everyone should just listen to me because I know what's right. I have everyone's best interests in mind, right? And relying on the self to do this and stop. I reflect, or the opposite, reflecting knowingly on the evil of one's heart. That's sort of the opposite side of the story. It's really the same story, okay? In the tradition of Pure Land Buddhism and Shin, there was a long-standing movement of people saying, we have to, if Amida Buddha's vow saves the evil person, we have to be evil. And not only that, we can be evil, okay? Because Amida's vow, because it saved us already, we're already saved, not only do we have to not do anything, we have a license to commit evil. That sort of antinomian licensed evil idea is one that was often present in Pure Land Buddhism and Shin Buddhism. Shinran was always critical of that. Okay, he said that is also a reflection of the mind of self-power. And finally, to abandon the judging of people as good or bad. Using our own flawed way of looking at the world, we make distinctions between people, between myself and others, men and women, old and young, etc. And we make value judgments based on our distinctions that we choose to make. We put the values on them, and because of that, we separate people out. We make decisions, we take actions, we say words that further cause people to divide, okay, further cause hatred and anger and all of those things that are part of human life because we act in that way, okay, that are part of the world today. So that's the mind of self-power. That's what Shinran says, abandon the mind of self-power. What does that mean is another question. How do we do it is another question altogether. And so Shinran also has this interesting phrase. He uses the word shame a lot. Maybe this is a Japanese cultural thing, but shame is a word that's very loaded culturally. To be quite honest, I kind of like the word shame. It has an emotional impact that other words might not have. Embarrassment doesn't work, But anyway, Shinran says this: when we who are so shameful go a step or two little by little along the white path of the power of the vow, we are taken in and held by the compassionate heart of the Buddha of unhindered light. This is a very Pure Land way of describing this experience of awakening to oneself through the illumination of Buddha wisdom, okay? So that's described in other traditions in different ways, but in the Pure Land terminology I think is inherently dualistic, okay? There's this world and the Pure Land, ourselves and Buddha, going to the Pure Land, all of those kind of words are used in a very sort of dualistic fashion. And so Pure Land terminology has a dualistic character to them. But using that type of terminology, I think Shinran is trying to get at this idea, is that we come to know ourselves through the arising of wisdom. So what's the next bullet point? We also realize a radical transformation of our consciousness. Here, somewhat related to what I was saying before, on the path of awakening, we receive clear insight and we come face to face with, one, the depth of our ego-centeredness and the boundless compassion of life, which constantly gives itself to us. So there's this dual sense of awakening, of realization in Shin, okay? It's not something, the Buddha's so great, life is wonderful, this world is a Pure Land, it's all good, la-li-da. That's important in a sense, because the Buddha's wisdom illuminates us, but what is illuminated? What is illuminated is the depth of our ego-centeredness, okay? What's illuminated is the nature of who I am, okay? And when I really am exposed to the light of Dharma, when I see myself in the mirror of Buddha, I often don't like what I see, okay? But that awakening to oneself, one's limitedness, one's conditioned nature, one's passions and delusions, that's in that awakening, one experiences wisdom. Okay, that's sort of this counterintuitive way that Shin talks about it. So I'm going to get into this, okay? So Shinran talks about this transformation as the wisdom of Shinjin. Now what could this mean? How is it that we actually experience wisdom? Do we suddenly become wise, sage-like beings? Are we virtual Buddhas walking around in our old skin? Shin Buddhism gives us great insight into this problem. It goes like this: when we truly awaken to the depth of our own foolishness, that is when we experience wisdom. It's sort of turns things on its head, but there's something to it. Now, I talked about this in the class today, so those of you who are here, you can close your ears. This is something that I mentioned, this study that I like very much. And basically, the study that I offered today in order to give us some sort of insight into this idea that Shinran's insight was that true wisdom is found in our experience of foolishness. So rather than read through all that, I'll relate to you the study. So once again, this is it's a study done by a psychologist at Cornell University years ago. His name was Dr. David Dunning. I hear that this study has been repeated many, many times with very similar results, almost the same results. What was the study? Dr. Dunning administered a test to some subject, probably college students, probably just a typical objective test that all college students are really good at. You know, reading comprehension, all these other things that that goes into that type of test. And then after having the subjects complete the test, they turned it in, he gave them another test, and the test was simply this: how well did you do on that test? And then he took their self-evaluation and compared the results. This is where it gets interesting. It said people who did really well on the first test, the objective test, he defined as people who are competent. And he said those competent people, when he compared their test results to their self-evaluation, is very different. He said the people who are competent tended to say, I did not do well in the test. I could have done better. I missed that question, okay? All of these kinds of things. And I look around and see all these really bright, brilliant college students. I think they're probably thinking the same thing. You're so used to getting 100 or 110 on tests that if you get a 99, it just eats away at you, right? So you have these really high standards. And so if you have a real high standard and you're competent, when you evaluate yourself really harshly, okay? I think that's one result. And that's something we can kind of understand. But it's the other result that's really fascinating. Because when he looked at people who didn't do well on the first test, he defined them as incompetent. He said when he compared their test results to their self-evaluation, again, a big difference. Because people who tended to be incompetent tended to say, I did really well on that test. I aced that test, right? And he concluded from this study is that competent people are so competent that they know when they're incompetent. But incompetent people are so incompetent that they don't know they're incompetent. So they think they're competent. That's the study. I think it's a great study. Anyway, like I said, I've heard that study's been replicated across the country with very similar results. And I've heard that from other people in other industries, both business and medical areas. They say they have the same sort of experience, which tells us about what Shinran is trying to get at, okay? If instead of using the words competency and incompetency, we just use wisdom and foolish, wise and foolish. He said, the wise person is so wise that this person realizes his own foolishness. But the foolish person is so foolish that he doesn't know he's a fool. He thinks he's wise. So when I self-evaluate myself as wise, it means I don't get it. I don't have a clue. But in Shinran's understanding, when one awakens to oneself, to one's limited nature as a foolish, ordinary being, okay, bound by evil karma and possessed of delusions and passions, one sees oneself for the first time. This is, in a sense, the awakening of wisdom in sort of a counterintuitive sense. And when that happens, we cast off the skin of our old selves little by little. We're nurtured to become our new selves and realize true growth as human beings. This is the language of Shigaraki Sensei. We naturally require that we grapple with the societal nature of human life in that way, because we realize that all of our presuppositions, all of the presumptions that I make about myself, of being this good person, wise, able to be very effective in my own agency and activity, knowing the way my life and other people's lives should go, knowing the way our country should go, this world should go, having these ideas that I have in mind that I've already formalized, that when I come to realize that these are really just a product of my own egocentricity, my own biases, my own prejudices, when I finally come to awaken that, I begin to see the world differently, okay? And the life that I had lived is no longer possible. It's now showing signs of rejecting this defiled world, in Shinran's words. And in Shigaraki Sensei's terminology, we shed the skin of our own lives. We realize new life, new growth as human beings. And when that occurs, we can't help but see others differently as well. So anyway, one of Shinran's words that I think is often overlooked he talks about a life of radical non-discrimination. He talks about the ocean of Shinjin. There's no discrimination between. Then he lists a lot of different alternatives and things like nobles versus humble, monks versus laity, men versus women, old versus young. He goes all the way down the list, and he includes many of the argument points, the conflict points that existed in Japan or Japanese Buddhism at the time. And he basically says, and all of those distinctions we make are false. They're all tinged with our own sense of ego and privilege and prejudice, and we think we're being fair-minded, but in reality, our thoughts and our perceptions, our views and understanding are grounded upon this fundamental fact that we don't get it, okay? And Shinjin is awakening to that fact, okay? In that experience, he uses many different words: inconceivable, inexplicable, indescribable. But he uses another phrase. He says this Shinjin or Nembutsu is medicine. It eradicates poisons. And the poisons include not only our foolishness, but also our own thoughts of our own wisdom as well. So Shinran engages then in this sort of unrelenting self-scrutiny. So, and not only that, this is also an aspect of his life and his thought that's not often emphasized, that Shinran, in his writings and his life, he stood alongside the masses at the base of society, okay? So he said things, he talked about shackled, foolish beings. That's us, he said. And so from an interior spiritual point of view, that's who we are. But from a sense of societal perspectives, we are the lowly who are hunters and peddlers. Now, hunters and peddlers, what are those? He explains it elsewhere. He says the hunters are ones who kill for a living. And the peddlers are ones who sell things like, especially liquor and that kind of thing. In other words, he was referring to people who at that time were considered to be the lowest of the low. Often maybe the outcasts, the untouchables of the world, the people who were working with dead bodies. And he said, these are who we are. Okay, he identified with it. He never identified with the aristocracy, never identified with the religious and political elite. He identified with the people who are the lowest rungs, the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed of society. And such evil people, he uses the word evil here, are none other than us. Okay, these people who live in the lower classes at the base of society, and he says are like stones and tiles and pebbles. Remember Unno Sensei's book, Tiles and Pebbles Turning to Gold. That's exactly the same imagery that Shinran is using here, okay? That is those people who we are, they are the rejected, the other, the marginalized, are the ones who, you know, we identify with because we find ourselves in like manner, these beings who have been set out, aside from, cast out, away from the core of both the religious world and society. Okay, next bullet point. This is kind of the main point of my talk. I'm sure. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to hurry up. Okay, by taking Amida's vows as our own, we are able to dare to aspire for peace and freedom and equality in ourselves and in the world. So I want to talk about this idea of taking the vows as our own. Now, you remember the story of the Bodhisattva. The typical narrative is that the Bodhisattva made these vows, 48 vows, long time ago, and the Bodhisattva became a Buddha, and now we just receive that salvation in a very passive sort of way, or it's looked upon in this historical sort of sense. Whereas I think people like Unno Sensei and Shigaraki Sensei saw this idea of the vow in a more active, more involved sense. Shinran also talked about living with prayers for the world. And so this is a phrase he didn't use often, but he used it on occasion when he talked to his Nembutsu followers. He said, when you say the Nembutsu, say it with the spirit of prayers for the world. May there be peace in the world. May the Buddha's teaching spread. And in Shin Buddhism, the primal vow takes the place of prayer. It's not, prayer is in the sense of our petition, asking for things, but the vow is, in a sense, prayer for us. It's a wish of life. I render the idea of the primal vow in this way, that it's a basic wish of life which seeks to become itself and to give itself to us, to others, so that they might live. That sense, once again, of a plant growing up with all the vibrancy and the life full of life, and then withering and dying, becoming the compost for the next form of life. That idea is, I think, the way in which we can understand this working of the primal vow. It's this wish of life to become itself. And that is understanding that and taking that wish into our own lives is what Shinran, I believe, called prayers for the world. I'm going to skip through a few things because we're running out of time, if you don't mind. And so Shigerai Sensei has this idea: we should take Amida's vows as our own, make Amida's wish our own wish. So what are the vows? Just run through this really quickly because there's more interesting things to get to. But there's 48 vows in the story of the Dharmakara Bodhisattva. The first to the 11th vows talk about the adornments of the Buddha's land. Okay, what kind of land will I make? I will make a land that's like this. The 12th to the 17th vow, vows for the adornments of the Buddha's body. What kind of Buddha will I be? This is the kind of Buddha I'll be. The 18th, 19th, and 20th vows are vows that say sentient beings will be able to be born in the Pure Land. So they set out the method of salvation or the method of liberation. The 21st to the 48th vows, they set out the benefits experienced by persons who live in the Nembutsu. And so that's the way we could structure and sort of divide, classify these various 48 vows. Now, Shigerai Sensei points to the first four in particular. This is quite interesting, I think, very unique. I've never heard anyone else present ideas in this way. The first vow is an interesting one. It says, in the Buddha's lands, there will be no hell, hungry ghosts, or animals. And so hell, hungry ghosts, and animals represents the three lowest rungs of the realms of samsara. Okay? After that, there's animals, and there's humans and devas. They're all the realm of ignorance and pain, the realm of samsara. And the first vow says, there'll be no hell, hungry ghosts, and animals. There'll be no greed, anger, and foolishness in the Pure Land. That is, the Pure Land is not samsara. The Pure Land is an enlightened realm, okay? It's a realm of freedom. And then the second is, person in that land will not fall back into evil realms, for no one will return to the place from which they came. So no one will fall back in the Pure Land. The third is that all beings will be of the color gold. That's kind of interesting. You know, all beings in the Pure Land are the color gold. I really didn't think about that very much. And the fourth is, no one will have any likes or dislikes. There'll be no discrimination in the Pure Land. So those are the features of the Pure Land in the first four vows. Shigerai Sensei looks at it this way. He says the first two vows are wishes for human fulfillment, of true freedom. The Buddha aspires that every being will realize true awakening and become a truly free or emancipated being. So it's a wish on the Buddha's part, a vow that all beings will become truly emancipated, truly free, truly liberated. The third and fourth vows are aspirations for the fulfillment of society, a world of true equality and respect and harmony. Okay, the Buddha aspires for the ideal state of humanity in the world, which is truly equal and without discrimination. So looking at it in this way, and it's kind of a revisionist way of looking at it, sure, but I think it's interesting that the vows of the Dharmakara Bodhisattva in the story aren't just a history lesson about things that might have occurred long, long ago before any of us were around, but they also set out ideals. Ideals or wishes for ourselves and for the world that are very much alive and relevant today. And so this idea that Shigerai Sensei makes is that it's important that we take these vows, these wishes as our own, that these become our ideals as well. And by doing so, not only are we sort of just according with the Buddha, but we're also, in a way, this is our own Bodhi mind. This is the awakening of our own Bodhi mind, our aspiration for enlightenment, but also the aspiration to bring enlightenment to all beings. Okay, so this sense then is a way in which we become actors in this narrative that's ongoing, not just sort of passive observers. There's a very famous author, wrote children's stories, other things, Miyazawa Kenji. He wrote this very interesting passage, which I think pertains to what we're talking about. He said, if the entire world is not happy, then there can be no individual happiness. Our consciousness of the self must expand gradually from the individual to the group and then to society and the universe. We're able to live with truth and vitality when we become aware of the existence of the universe within ourselves and live in accordance with it. May we always search for true happiness in the world, for the path of search is our path. Okay? I think this really captures the Bodhisattva spirit, but in many ways it also is a way of encouraging us to take the Buddha's vows as our own, to aspire for human fulfillment and the fulfillment of this world, realizing that this idea of the self is not confined to this little narrow perspective that I have, just me, myself, and I, but in this interrelatedness, interconnectedness of all being, the inseparability of all beings, that the idea of self expands to others, to all of us here today, to our families and loved ones, to those we can't stand, to those in the world whose lives have been vital to our being born, to growing up in both positive and negative ways, to the very universe itself, that our self expands to that dimension where we can say that the universe exists within ourselves. And when we have this broader notion of self, and I think this is really very much in keeping with the Buddhist sense of non-self, by the way, I think that this sense then allows us to realize that there can be no happiness. I can never realize happiness unless all beings are happy. Or in the words of the vow, I cannot realize enlightenment unless all beings realize enlightenment. That becomes the fundamental spirit of the vow, and it's the fundamental spirit of Mahayana as well, I think. And so this phrase, prayers for the world, we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip through a few things because I want to get to Unno Sensei. Okay, I'm going to jump. Sorry about that. So, this last part, with grateful awareness of our stake in all being, it enables us to engage authentically in compassionate work. I think Shinran, in his many writings, provides us with certain clues or hints or indications of what our lives can be like. He says, for instance, upon awakening in this life, our evil nature or actions are transformed. Our evil is transformed into the highest good. So that which has been, in a sense, our evil being, anything that I do or say or think, which is based in my own ignorance and self-centeredness and foolishness, that this very nature of myself, as I awaken to it, it can be transformed, okay? I'm still this person that I am, but now this awakening, this understanding, this realization of myself in this broader sense of self and other, can bring about the highest good in life. We realize joy. He says our hearts and minds become soft and gentle, and yet they're also diamond-like, unhindered by all evil forces. We say the Nembutsu is a response of gratitude for the Buddha's benevolence. We're able to constantly practice great compassion. Now, that's the latter part that I just wanted to talk about a little bit. Talk about authentic appreciation. I'm going to skip through a number of these things, if that's okay. That as we struggle with this widening gap between our reality and our ideals, we somehow encounter infinite light in life in spite of ourselves. I think this is what I call the logic of other power. Let me just talk about this for a second, because this is my own construction, so it's subject to criticism. Other power is often looked upon as being some big other out there, and we tend to think, oh, it's Buddha out there throwing down thunderbolts of power. I think that's not the imagery that Shinran describes for us. Rather, I liken other power and self-power to a sense of logic. So there's a logic of self-power. The logic is very simple. It goes like this. If I try very hard, and as a result of my efforts, I attain great benefit. Because the logic of self-power makes sense, because we apply the logic of self-power every day. You know, that's how we get into Smith College. That's how we get the job that we want. That's how we build new libraries. That's how we construct civilizations. We employ the logic of self-power, and we do it every day. But the problem is when we try to apply that logic to our religious lives, then we run into trouble. Okay? Because if we think, I'm going to do this, and because of that, I'm going to get great benefit, I'm going to attain enlightenment, that's when we stumble upon, or we stumble over our ego. We stumble over our attachments. We stumble over our prejudice and presuppositions, okay? So the logic of other power is something that applies in our religious life, okay? It goes like this. I try very hard. So the first parts are the same, and the last part is the same. I attain great benefit, but the difference is in the middle. The logic of other power, in my mind, is I try very hard, and yet, in spite of my efforts, I attain great benefit. That's the logic of other power. It doesn't make any sense in this conventional world, okay? Sure, I try, and because I try, because I do things, I'm competent, I attain great benefit. It makes sense. Why would it be that, and yet, in spite of my efforts, I attain great benefit? I think that's where the logic of other power involves this awakening. that middle section is the awakening of Shinjin, okay, awakening to ourself, to the true nature of ourselves and the greater self that we have yet to awaken to. I think that's the sense that is the core of other power, and it also becomes the core of our deep sense of appreciation and gratitude, and I think becomes the foundation for our being able to act in a compassionate way. So there are a lot of things we talk about. The paramita, many of you are familiar with. These are, they mean perfections, literally. They're practices that bodhisattvas do to attain nirvana, okay? But in addition, they're ideals for practice and living. They're virtues that we can receive and we can aspire to every day. Many people in Jodo Shinshu reject the paramita and say, oh, self-power, we don't do that, okay? But I think, again, I think we have to look in this more in a deeper way, okay? So the paramita are ideals. We aspire to live in this way. We may not attain that in any given time, but we can always aspire, okay? So dana, selfless giving, sila, virtue, morality, kshanti, patience, tolerance, forbearance, virya, energy, diligence, effort, dhyana, concentration, contemplation, prajna, wisdom, and insight, okay? But in addition to all this, internally, when we seek to live within the ideals that are set out and we find ourselves falling short, we find, we realize a sense of shame. And again, I kind of like the word, okay? But the other side of shame is gratitude, okay, in this sense. Shame is not, oh, I'm a terrible person, oh, I'm a lousy person, but it's that this person who I thought I was this really active, very effective, direct and dynamic person who's driving the bus, I realize that I'm not doing it and that I'm limited in many ways, but at the same time I realize I'm still alive and I'm able to live and love and grow in ways that are inconceivable to me, but not because of who I am, but through all of the other influences in my life. So the sense of shame, maybe too strong of a word here. I think the other side is one of gratitude. So shame and gratitude are always experienced as one. And externally, we express our appreciation through stories, verses, images, and songs, and we're moved in response to share this appreciation with all. So here I want to jump through a number of things, kind of ending up, because we're at 6 now, and I'm supposed to end, it's thereabouts? Okay, we're on California time, okay. So here, this is a haiku. This was actually written by my teacher, Shigerai Sensei. He did the calligraphy and he drew these little pictures here. He's a better calligrapher than he was an artist. But anyway, this is a haiku. In Japanese it goes, Shibugaki no shibu ga sonomama amami kana. That's a haiku. I translate it in this way. Ah, how very sweet is the bitterness of the bitter persimmon. Those of you who know about persimmons are kaki. It's a fruit that grows. Do you grow persimmons around here? California, we get them all over the time. Available, okay, but they grow everywhere in California. And there's 2 types. There's a sweet kind that's kind of squat and fat. It looks like a tomato. You could eat it right like an apple. It's really sweet. There's another type that's sort of elongated. That's a bitter persimmon called a shibugaki. You can't eat those because if you eat, your mouth will pucker up like that. I think the word is astringent. You can't eat them. They're so bitter. But if you peel the persimmon and hang them out in the air, over the course of weeks and months, the air, the sun, everything else will begin to make the persimmon dry up and shrivel up. And they become what's called hoshigaki, or they're the dried persimmons. That's what we have here. The dried persimmons become incredibly sweet. The more bitter the original persimmons were, the sweeter are the dried persimmons. The bitterness doesn't go away, but it's transformed. It's transformed into sweetness. Just like our own hindrances, our own obstacles, our own limitations that we awaken to can become the stuff of enlightenment, okay? I think that's what that poem tells us. Compassion is important. Compassion is very important. Compassion, in Japanese, the word is jihi. Jihi, the word is might. Oh, I'm sorry, didn't mean to do that. Okay. Okay, this is what I want to do. So ji is maitri. We'll look at that meaning. It means friendliness, intimate feelings of fellowship, close connections. Hi is karuna, sympathy, pity, feelings of deep compassion. So the combined are jihi, maitri, karuna. Now, compassion is a very important idea. It's a very important concept. It's a very important ideal for us. It's a very important aspect of our lives. but it also has some depth to it. This is one I came across the internet. Those of you who knew Unno Sensei, well, is this really his poem? This is attributed to him, but I've never come across it. But it sounds like him. Might as well be him. Okay, it goes like, such sorrow, the cry of true compassion sinks into my hard ego. Sounds like Unno Sensei. Let's say he wrote it. Or someone who's inspired by him wrote it, who knows. But the sorrow, the cry of true compassion, this sense of compassion is crying for us. The Buddha weeps for us, okay? The Buddha sorrows for us in this condition. And the cries sink into my hard ego, okay? If the Buddha were simply saying, you're an idiot, you better be better, you have to try harder, you're no good, I would fight back. But to know that the Buddha cries for me, and those hot tears of sorrow and lamentation and compassion, they come directly and they sink into my hard ego, okay? So this is the meaning of compassion, okay? There's another rendering of compassion in the early sutras, the Brahma Vihara, I think many people are familiar with. They sort of give us different categories of compassion. We see Maitri, Metta, loving kindness, Karuna we saw before, compassion, the wish that all beings be free from suffering, Mudita, sympathetic joy for the happiness and virtues of all being, and Upekka, Upeksha, equanimity, acceptance of both failure and success with detachment. So these ideas of compassion taking various forms, various dimensions is very important in Buddhism. I think the same could be said as far as our own lives in which we find ourselves able to constantly practice great compassion. And it goes both ways, to feel the compassion that we receive, but also to turn around and allow that wish, those cries to become our own. And I don't have time for this. This is from Tanisho, which you're studying in class. This is from chapter 4, Unno Sensei's translation. Very interesting one. If you want to talk about this later on, I'll be happy to do so. I think this is really, this chapter or section of the text is also one that's very problematic. It's been the source of great confusion and discord, but I think there's great depth to it. So we'll come back to it, but I want to move on to a few other things. Buddha's mind of great compassion. Okay, so let's go on to the end because I really want to just end with a few things, okay, or before we get there. So we end with a sense that this sense of appreciation is not only of gratitude, is not only as we look about and we see the lives and the impact of the lives of others upon our own, people who we know and people we don't even know. But we also come to understand that, that as we encounter Amida's vow, this immeasurable light in life, we find that life has this wish to become itself and to give itself to us. And when that wish is fulfilled within our own lives, within our own awakening and our own sense, we realize deep appreciation. Okay, so there's a lot of ways in which it's expressed. And as I mentioned before, often the expression is better made in terms of poetry or verse or songs rather than just discourse. And here's one of them. This is written by a poet in Japan. His name is Sakamura Shinmin. He's a Pure Land Buddhist, not a Shin Buddhist, but a Pure Land Buddhist. He wrote a lot of wonderful poems. One of my wishes in life, if I ever live long enough, is to translate Sakamura's poems into English. So this is my translation of one of his poems called Tega Hoshi, I want to have arms, okay? And it goes like this. In a picture entitled Mother, drawn by a child who could not see, she is portrayed as having many arms. As I gazed at that portrait, I clearly understood the reality of the 1,000-arm Kannon. Since then, each one of her arms seems to have come fully alive. That strange figure is no longer strange at all, for it has taken on the image of truth. Ah, I also want to have 1,000 arms, for the children in Vietnam and Pakistan, for the children in India and Nepal. So the imagery here is of a child. Sakamura is talking about a child who is visually impaired. I don't know to what extent, I don't know if it's a boy or girl, it really doesn't matter. He's talking about this child, and this child has drawn a picture, probably more skillfully than I did. This is my drawing. You can tell how unskillful I am. But this is the idea, okay? So Sakamura is looking at this drawing of the mother by the child, and he says, that's odd. Why did the child give the mother many different arms? And then, as he continued to gaze at this photo, this drawing, he came to understand, as he said, the reality of the thousand-armed Kannon. Some of you may have seen that. I should have put an image on this. Kannon is the Bodhisattva of compassion. In Sanskrit, the name is Avalokiteshvara. In Chinese, Guanyin. In Japanese, Kannon. Okay, and so this Bodhisattva of compassion is always sort of along with Amida to really emphasize the compassionate aspect of Amida. Here, this Bodhisattva has really, I think, really means a lot to people in Asian countries. Okay. And one of the ways in which this Bodhisattva is depicted in terms of both portraits but also mainly sculptures is that the Bodhisattva has many, many arms. Have you seen any, you've seen this before, right? So if you go to like Japan, you go Sanju Sangendo in Kyoto or other places, you'll see all these Bodhisattvas with many, many arms and many, many heads, many, many faces, okay? So the arms have hands that could hold different things like books or hammers or swords or pens, this type of thing, which means compassionate activity takes many forms, okay? We can receive the compassion of others, not only of a parent, but of an author, of a farmer, of many people whose lives and activities, whose wishes and accomplishments have allowed us to have life. And so that's what's being discussed here. That's what Sakamura says. Sakamura says, now I understand what the thousand-armed Kannon meant. Because you can imagine the child who's visually impaired perhaps cannot see at all. For that child, her mother is Kannon, okay, who has 1,000 arms. So at times the mother is bathing the child, at times cooking for the child, at times helping the child to get dressed, maybe combing the child's hair, helping the child with homework, pushing the child out the door. All of these different hands and arms, okay? And for the child then, of course, her mother has 1,000 arms. In like manner, compassion has 1,000 arms, okay? And so that's when Sakamura says, each one of her arms is alive. Now I understand. This strange figure is no longer strange, for it's taken on the form of truth. And as an immediate response, he says, I want to have 1,000 arms. Because I see the importance of the 1,000 arms. I've received the 1,000 arms as well. I wish I had 1,000 arms to reach out to help the children of the world, okay? So I think that sense is what I tried to talk about earlier. I think the poetry does a better job for us, okay? And there's another little coda to this. I learned after doing some research into Sakamura and translating this poem that, in fact, in Japan, people who are visually impaired just have an affinity for Kannon. There's just a connection there, a close connection that is beyond words, okay? There's another thing I want to talk about. This is one of Unno Sensei's translations. This is from Renyo, who is the 8th head priest of the Honganji. Renyo wrote a lot of letters, and one of his famous letters is Letter on White Ashes. This letter is traditionally, in the Shin Buddhist tradition, is read at funerals. I read this at Unno Sensei's funeral, okay? I read his translation of it. But it has deep meaning, and Unno Sensei's translation, I think, is really wonderful. He talks about the impermanence of life. That's what Renyo does. So let me just read you, this is part of the letter. This is Unno Sensei's translation. He says, whether I go before or others go before me, whether it be today or be tomorrow, who is to know? Those who lead before us are as countless and fragile as the drops of dew. Though in the morning we may have radiant health, in the evening we may be white ashes. By so understanding the meaning of death, we shall come to fully appreciate the meaning of this life, which is unrepeatable and thus to be treasured above all else. I have to say, this is not a close literal translation, and I'm glad it's not. I think Unno Sensei put his heart into this translation. And what it speaks to is this realization that Renyo presents to us, is that our lives are impermanent and fragile, that the nature of humanity, the nature of our lives is that our lives will end, okay? The nature of being young is that we will hopefully grow old, or being healthy, that we may grow sick, and to be alive is that someone day will die. And this is a truth that is true for all beings, okay? So just to hear the Buddha say all things change, that's kind of intellectual, but to experience it in real life, to know that life is fragile and fleeting, is something, it's something that we don't often face. We face it at times of loss at funerals. We face it at times of loss in other circumstances. But Renyo urges us to face it at all moments in our lives. Because if we do, and death here is not just physical death, but death, I think, of our expectations, our hopes, of our dreams, death of of the person that we thought we needed to be or should be, that spiritual death as well. We come to fully appreciate the meaning of this life, which is unrepeatable, thus to be treasured above all else. We turn to the infinite depth and breadth and treasure of life at these moments. I think that's what Renu was saying, and Unno Sensei's translation, I think, expresses that very beautifully. Which brings me to the end of my talk now, is this final poem, which is another haiku poem written by the very famous haiku poet Issa, Kobayashi Issa. I think along with Basho and Buson, he's one of the three great haiku poets of Japan. Issa was a Pure Land Buddhist. Okay? He was a Jodo Shinchi Buddhist, okay? Or no, he was Jishu, but he was Pure Land Buddhist, okay? He wrote a lot of poems about his life, less so about life in general, but sometimes the poems were very kind of concrete, sometimes somewhat profane, but always very interesting. This is one of his famous ones, okay? And Unno Sensei did a translation of this. This appears in his book Tanisho, okay? And so the Japanese is Tsuyu no yo wa Tsuyu no yo nagara sari nagara, which Unno Sensei translates as a world of dew is a world of dew, and yet. Okay? That's probably familiar to all of you in the Northampton Shin Buddhist Sangha. This is one of the real important, beautiful pieces of poetic art, I think, in the Shin tradition, translated by Unno Sensei. I think this could mean a lot of different things. Perhaps one way of understanding it is this. Issa lived a really difficult life. He lived in this hut for a long period of time, okay? He had a family one time. He had property and an estate, and he lost all of his worldly possessions. He lost many of his family members to death. So he really experienced the impermanence of life. So when he said a world of dew, that's one of the expressions in Japanese meaning life is impermanent. Life is like the dew on a blade of grass, where in the morning it's lingering on the blade of grass, and then when the sun comes out, it evaporates and disappears into the air. Okay, so our lives are like dew. And so a world of dew is talking about the impermanence of life. And so when Issa says a world of dew, the first world of dew, I think, is kind of that. He's learned this is a Buddhist teaching. Life is impermanent, everything changes. But then he goes on to say, is a world of dew. Okay? It's not a theory, it's not a teaching, it's not an abstract notion. Life is change. And I'm experiencing it personally in a very difficult, sometimes heartbreaking way. You know, I've lost my worldly possessions, my family, my wives, my children. A world of dew is a world of dew. And yet, I can't let go. I know that life has changed. I know that all things that are alive will die, and yet I can't let go. I can't let go of my loved ones. I can't let go. I can't let go. What's wrong with me? And then he ends with this wonderful phrase, and yet even such a person as this, who is lost and loved and lost and yet can't let go, hangs on by my bloody fingertips to all those things that make me feel good, hangs on to the vestiges of my ego. Even such a person as me is embraced by Amida's vow. Okay, so that sense I think is very important. Yes.
How do the words literally?
Yeah. How do they fit? Yeah. I try to put them in that order. Okay, so Tsuyu no yo wa is equivalent to a world of dew. Then Tsuyu no yo nagara is a world of dew and yet. I think that's a good.
That's a literal.
Yeah, it's pretty literal. This is pretty literal translation. It's very lyrical, but pretty literal. And this last sari nagara, and yet it is so. That sort of thing. And yet at the same time, it is so. Okay, so I think his translation is very good, literal and yet really beautiful and profound. Okay. Yes.
Yes, I appreciate your talk. It's very
Sure.
And I had a question. I read that Shinran wrote a sentence. He said, "I am neither priest nor layman."
Right.
And I heard a person say that was one of the most revolutionary statements ever made.
Yeah.
And some people here in the audience know, but some people might not know.
Uh-huh.
Is he? And you can correct me if I'm wrong. He was orphaned at age 9 and went to the mountains at Tendai.
That's right.
Mountain for 20 years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
was highly trained
Yeah.
and meditated for 20 years.
Yeah.
And he came down from the mountain and threw off his black coat. quote.
Mhm.
And I understand he went into meditation because he,
Right.
and then he had a spirit. This is the
No, that's right. Go ahead. You're
he had
doing a great job.
spiritual
Yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
and then he met a man named Honan
Hmm.
who changed his life, and then
Yeah.
he ended up going to the countryside with the common people.
Yeah.
And he became the first Buddhist priest to marry, officially marry,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and had children, which was,
Right.
this was, I think in Japan, the priest couldn't officially marry
Right.
until 1870
Right.
or 80.
That's right.
But that statement, I'm neither priest nor layman, and
Yeah.
could you just, that's always appealed to me about the teaching of Jodo Shin is that
Sure.
is Shinnon's writing and just
Yeah.
his life. He was an incredible writer.
Yeah.
Just the way he lived his life.
Right.
So,
Well, I think you said it very well. You said it very well. One thing to add to your explanation is that after he met Honen was the person who really established the Jodoshu, the Pure Land school. It became very popular in Japan, so popular that it began threatening the religious establishment, who was tied very closely to the government. And so one thing led to another, and the Pure Land movement was suppressed. It was outlawed. Some people were put to death. Honen, Shinran, and others were sent into exile. And they were defrocked. Their priestly status was taken away by the government, which had the power to do it. They lost their priestly names. They were giving lay names, okay? And so Shinran, his name at the time was Zenshin. He was given the name Fuji no Yoshizane, okay, which is a layperson's name. But he didn't accept that, okay? So he went up to the northern regions. He was exiled, and looking within not only the circumstances of the time, which is very true. He was no longer a priest, but he also didn't consider himself to be a layperson. But in a more deeply spiritual sense, I think he understood that distinction we make, that sense of it has to be either or, he rejected, okay? So in Japanese society at the time, you're either a priest or you're not, okay? And he said, I reject that as a distinction. Just as, I find myself able to overcome other false distinctions. And so I think that became then the real source of his spiritual life. And then he took his own name. He took the name Shinran, but he also took the name Gutoku, which is foolish, stubble-haired, which is an interesting name to take, right? He said, this is the name that describes me, okay? So you're right. I think neither priest nor layperson, neither monk nor layman is very, very vital, important description of his religious understanding.
and he was the first to marry and have children, right? Officially.
Legally, yeah, openly.
Openly.
Right.
So-
Right. Yeah, priests were doing that, but they weren't doing it openly, so, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, a really complicated question.
Sure.
I'm interested in eternity. So,
Ah.
just as an earring is endless.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit?
That's quote by Shotoku.
Where
Okay.
it came.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Let's see.
You should reflect on your own faults, even when another is
Yeah.
furious with you.
So here, both he and I are sometimes wise and sometimes foolish, just as an earring is endless, which means it's on and on. It goes on and on. Sometimes we're wise, sometimes we're foolish. We're always going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So it's not that I'm just wise person, but and it's not that he's always this fool or vice versa. It's this ongoing sort of, kind of back and forth.
I just don't get the earring.
Well, it's just a round. It's just a loop. Is all he's referring to.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I see.
yeah. Just circular. It's going on and on and on. Endless. There's endless claims of being wise and foolish. Yeah, loop. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's good. I think we've.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you'll all come over to Dewey Hall in a further conversation there. Thank you so much for
Thank you very much.
immeasurable life.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.